Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we are going to get into the sobering truth of suicide. And as always, I want to start with a trigger warning. We are going to be talking about suicide. And so if you or someone you know is experiencing a mental health crisis or is feeling suicidal, please reach out to 988 to get access to the suicide prevention hotline. They are trained professionals who can help you with a suicide crisis. So if you are having thoughts or feelings of suicide, even if you aren't in the process of wanting to complete suicide, you can still reach out to them if you are feeling hopeless or like you want to die.
Well, I think that's even better to do it sooner. I mean, I think
that's true. Yeah.
With a lot of issues, the sooner you approach it and start to deal with it, the better, the easier it is.
Yeah.
If you wait till you've actually got a plan, then it becomes harder.
It's true. So Don't wait until it's too late.
No, don't wait.
Okay. So the focus of today's episode is going to be why people get to this point of feeling like they want to commit suicide. And we know that hopelessness is the driving factors. People reach this sense of hopelessness, like nothing can change and like they're just stuck in misery, which we've all been through periods in our lives where things are just hard. And sometimes people get stuck in that, or they get so stuck in the moment and it feels like it's never going to end, or they don't see an end, or they feel that their only way out is to die.
Yeah.
So how do they get to that point? What drives somebody to that?
That is such a good question, and one that I don't know if there's an answer to it.
Yeah.
But it's certainly the common theme that I've seen in people who are suicidal is, for whatever reason, they feel stuck. Another word I use is often stuck. So depression, I mean, we have to talk about depression as being a component. Right. But I think that hopelessness would be one of those common themes in depression. And so if you're depressed and you're stuck, then it's very literally hard to move forward.
Yeah.
Like a lot of people who are depressed or hopeless don't move at all. And I'm not talking just about exercising, but even getting out of the house and going on a walk or moving forward in any way. And it's pretty symbolic. And what I think what I've been realizing is that one of the best ways to help someone feel less hopeless or less depressed is to get them moving in some way. Mm-hmm. Even, just a short walk or something like that, or even moving around the house. And so I think that part of the hopelessness is they become stuck and they don't move. Mm-hmm. And the people who are around them and love them don't know what to do about that. I hear that all the time.
Yeah.
Like they might say, well, let's get out and go on a walk, and they just won't do it. So the hopelessness comes from, if you think about things you can be hopeless, financial situation, relationships. If you're stuck in a financial situation that you think there's no way out of, that's pretty hopeless. I mean, what are you going to do about that? And the same thing in relationships. I think sometimes relationships feel like there's no way out, or this is such a terrible relationship, it's not going to improve. One of the things, I was going to mention some statistics now, but before I do that, what I want to say, my disclosure is, there are a lot of conflicting statistics out there. And so when I talk about the things that I've done a little bit of research and seen what's out there, there is contradictory information. And so I want our listeners to understand, like when I'm saying something, I'm not saying this is exactly the way it is. It's just not. I think this is a really, really hard topic to get any good, solid information on. We're going to go through in a bit suicide rates for different countries, or, socioeconomic status, the role it plays in suicide. And it's conflicting. And the latest statistics I can find, this is always a little frustrating, 2021. So, that's not that long ago, 3 years ago. Suicide was the second leading cause of death for people ages 10 to 14 and 20 to 34.
Hmm.
And
Interesting.
then also men ages 75 and older. Now think about that group for a minute. So especially the first one. So
Hmm.
you have a group that cognitively they're not fully developed at all, not even
Right.
close to it. So it kind of makes sense that it would be easy for them to get hopeless. Now, Adrian's going to talk about adolescence and suicide, but I've
Hmm.
wondered in that age group, how does social comparison fit into it and social
Hmm.
media? And she'll go into that more, but I think there's a component of if you are in a situation and you see others in your same peer group who, let's say, might be better off, or you might perceive them to be more socially popular,
Hmm.
then I think with that immature brain, it'd be easy to get into that hopeless place. And also, I mean, we know this for true adolescents don't make good decisions often, and they
Right.
often make very quick decisions.
Yeah.
So as I looked at that statistic about the two age groups, then 75 and older, I mean, if you think about men 75 and older, I would guess a lot of them are living alone. There are probably health problems. I mean, it seems to me that it'd be easy in that age group to feel hopeless. For a lot of men, they have their identity in what they did for work, their career, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Typically at 75, that's gone. You don't have that anymore. So all of a sudden, you've lost your identity that you've had for 50 years. And your relationship may be suffering or non existent. You might be alone. There may be health issues. I think for a lot of people, if they don't take care of themselves, after about 75, it's hard to move. So it goes back to that whole symbolic thing of movement. So
Yeah.
it kind of makes sense to me, those age groups. And as you're approaching the end of life, I wonder if it becomes easier to be hopeless.
I also wonder too if it's not a little bit of a cultural issue for that age group because we don't place as much value and as much emphasis
Right.
on family. And so I think that these 75-year-old men or that are alone and feeling hopeless and feeling suicidal, I wonder if they're maybe have a lot of medical problems and they're worried about
Right.
being a burden to their family, or
Right.
they don't have family around. And so what happened to get them disconnected? Are they estranged from their children? Do they not live close to their children or their grandchildren or, family members? Because we know that as humans, we are hardwired to connect and we need connection. Just because you age doesn't mean that need for connection goes away. In fact, if anything, I wonder if it becomes more important.
Well, I think it probably does become more important, but what you're saying made me realize something that I think in our culture, we don't value people who are older,
We
really.
don't.
We
Yeah.
value youth, we value looks, we value money,
Yeah.
and for a lot of people when they get older, they look old. Often they don't have a lot of money. Where I think there are cultures and countries that do value older people. I was thinking on longevity. This was something that came out on longevity. There are those areas around the world that I can't remember what they call them. They're blue zones or something, where people live over 100. And one of them
Yeah.
is in a particular place in Italy. And as I was reading about it, one, there's a lot of movement. They're always walking up and down hills. But one of the things that stood out to me is that the culture values those people who are older.
Yeah.
They don't see them as a burden. They see them as an asset of someone who has experience, in life, who can offer, good advice to those people who are younger. And so it's this value. And I
Hmm.
don't know that we value older people in our culture. And that might be part of the problem.
An interesting trend that I've noticed for my generation in particular is that we want to blame their parents. So I wonder if
Hmm.
this is maybe a
Hmm.
symptom of that. So, I mean, because they look at all of these problems that they're having, maybe social, emotional relationship problems, and they want to say, "Oh, it's my parents' fault. It's because of the way my parents raised me."
Yeah.
And I don't think that that's helpful because,
No.
and Mark, you and I have said two things that are a little bit contradictory,
What's
maybe,
that?
but well, parents are going to make mistakes, but
That's right.
parents are also doing the best that they can.
Right.
And, so
I
on the
believe
one
that.
yeah. And so, on the one hand, did your parents make mistakes? Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
But the majority of the parents, I think they really just tried their best. And I think gratitude for that could be important. So it sounds like this is a cultural thing. So I think about, a lot of maybe Asian cultures, China or India, where your elders are really respected. I wonder what the comparison is like
Well,
there.
because I can tell you, at least for suicide. Now we don't know about ages, but I didn't write down the number for China, but I did remark that it was lower. And so here's some statistics from that site that you sent me. In the USA in 2021, we had 14.1
Yeah.
suicides per 100,000 people. In China, and I'm just pulling this out, it was lower. It was eight
I
something.
have it pulled up here. It's 6.8 deaths per 100,000 people. So the suicide
In
rate
China.
in China,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay. So it's considerably lower. And I think you maybe bring up a good point. I mean, this issue is complicated, so you can't
Yes,
just say,
it
well,
is.
this is the thing. But
Yeah.
I think it's interesting to look at the possibilities of what's going on. And so I think that's right. In some Asian cultures, for example, or the Italy, the
Hmm.
one I mentioned, the valuing of older people probably changes that statistic in that older group as far as
Yeah.
suicide. So I was
Yeah.
surprised at that. We can talk about that in a bit when we get into socioeconomic. But I think going back to hopelessness, it's being stuck and seeing that there's no way out of whatever you're in. Now, it could be health issues,
Hmm.
which is, I mean, that is a real thing, certainly, that, the whole idea about euthanasia,
Yeah.
assisted suicide. And there are some countries where it is legal now. I think the Netherlands, Switzerland. And there are things you have to do in order to be able to legally do that. For some people, they are stuck in terrible health
Yeah.
issues with
Yeah.
no way out. And in our culture, there's no real good way to end your life if it's just going to be suffering for the next 10 years. And I think that medicine nowadays is pretty good at being able to say, yeah, we can't do anything to help you. This is going to be really hard. Like if you're on opiates for the rest of your life, I mean, that was
Yeah.
terrible. Anyway, that's a whole nother subject. I think it's those age groups to me were really interesting though.
Yeah.
Adolescents and older people.
Yeah. Which I think a lot of it has to do with the values that society places,
Hmm.
right? I mean, and so if you think about this younger age group, at least I know in America, we place so much value on material things,
Right.
right? And so you have this comparison that we talked about. And in other countries, I think family is considered of higher value.
Right.
um Intergenerational cohabitation, is
Okay.
that
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So families living together, I mean, and there are a lot of cultures, I think, cultures maybe such as, I believe it's like Brazil or other cultures, where it's expected that eventually your mother or mother-in-law or a family member is going to live with you.
Yeah.
That's just part of the expectation.
So I was looking at these statistics. Peru, Colombia, Indonesia. Now
Hmm.
I don't know a lot about those countries, but I would guess that the acceptance of that intergenerational living is higher.
Yeah.
So Peru, the rate's 1.5.
Hmm.
Colombia 4.7, Indonesia 1.3
Yeah.
in 2021. I mean, think how much lower that is. So it's not like Peru is a wealthy country
Right.
with a lot of assets. I mean, generally, it's not a wealthy country like the USA. We're 14.1, they're 1.5. What's going on there? What
Yeah.
is the difference? And
Hmm.
I haven't found anything that talks about what the difference, because that's pretty complicated,
Yeah.
when you look at that. But even for Canada and the UK, they're lower than we are. Canada
Yeah.
8.1, UK 8.8.
Well, even
Uh,
Mexico is 6.9.
you see, in those cultures, I mean, I think you hit on something. In those cultures, having intergenerational living that might be a factor to decrease suicide. I mean, it could
Yeah.
be.
Yeah. Well, and that's
And
also something that we've talked about in the past. A while ago, we did an episode, we called it a mental health mini, and it was our ideas of what we could do to help with the suicide rates. And I think we hit on two important things is greater access to mental health care. That has got to change. We're getting better, but we've got a ways to go. And the other one is family. I think that a really
Right.
great way to help prevent suicide is to create better familial structures or to help strengthen families.
So here, I'm going to read this, though, just because I thought, being in the business that I am, that
Hmm.
greater access to mental health would be important. So I came from the Federal Reserve, for whatever reason, made a study
Okay.
about suicide and income. But so here's what it says. The last sentence. Overall, our results indicate increasing access to mental health resources and suicide awareness education programs are unlikely to reduce the number of deaths by suicide, thus highlighting the complexity of
Hmm.
addressing rising suicide rates in the U.S. So what that just says to me is that it's really complicated, and just giving people more access to mental health is not necessarily the answer. I do think, though, what you just said as far as relationships.
Yeah.
So, we come back to this in many episodes, the importance of connection and relationship. And I wonder if that's what's more important, and that in our culture, for a lot of people, those relationships are fractured or
Yeah.
disconnected, and
Right.
that might be a big problem.
Yeah. And I mean, I think maybe that's our big takeaway from this
Hmm.
episode is relationships really matter and connection really matters.
And it kind of ties into what we talked about last week, which was the idea of, when we were talking, or the week before, suicide prevention,
Yeah.
but the idea that loved ones need to be paying attention
Yeah.
to what's going on with people in their family, and then don't be afraid to talk about it and bring it up. And I think that often people are afraid. Anyway, that finding from that Fed study was really surprising to me.
Yeah.
Um, that it's not necessarily access to mental health that's going to change this.
I think it's values. And I don't know how we change what we value as a society. So, this makes me reflect on my own family, right? On both sides. And I feel like my family has placed a good emphasis on family. I feel like that is where our values
Hmm.
lie. So, I mean, I think about my own relationship with my parents, how much I value my parents, and the same goes for Curtis's side of the family. I mean, we moved out to Indiana to be closer to his mom, and
Hmm.
then his dad literally lives with us
Yeah.
and has for 2 years now. That's another thing that's really unique is intergenerational living does not often work well in the United States.
Yeah.
My case is very much an anomaly. And then I also think about my own dad's relationship with his parents. He loves his parents. He's very close with his parents, and he highly, highly values their input and what they say. And I don't know if my dad would be unique to in if for your generation, Mark, or what your
Hmm.
thoughts are. Now, I know that you had an estranged relationship with your
Yeah.
parents
With
in the
my
end.
parents. So I don't
And
know that I'm the best
yeah.
one to talk about that. I do believe that what you're saying, though, as
Hmm.
the importance of those intergenerational relationships, I think
Yeah.
that's really true.
Yeah.
And I believe that also in our culture, we don't necessarily, a lot of us focus on the importance of that like we should compared to other culture. In your outline, you talked about the World Health Organization.
Hmm.
It says 77% of global suicides occur in low and middle income countries. Now, I don't know how they came up with that.
Right.
I'm thinking that that's not that interesting. Here's the reason why.
Hmm.
I would guess that 77% of the world's population lives in low and middle income countries. So
Okay.
if
Yeah.
if you're saying that 77% of the suicides occur there, well, that's where the people live. So
Okay. Right.
I
Well.
think I think that our world in data org.suicide, which is the link that you sent me,
Hmm.
that's
Yeah.
a little bit more interesting to me because it's talking about worldwide what's going on.
Right.
So we're talking about, bringing up the idea that, say, in lower income countries, is the suicide rate higher? I think, at least what I'm getting from this, is the answer is no.
Right.
At
Yes.
least it doesn't stand out that way. So again, going back to that Fed study and talking about socioeconomic influence, is that what they found is, again, this is where it's conflicting. Okay, so I want to be
Yeah.
clear. This is conflicting information, even within the study, that they found in one part of the study, they're talking about how in higher socioeconomic areas, the suicide rate is higher.
Hmm.
More college education indicates in their study higher suicide rate.
Interesting. Okay.
But as they broke it down a little bit more, there was one piece where it talked about if you are lower SES living in a higher SES area. So does that make sense? You're
Yeah.
lower SES living in a higher SES area, then your chance of suicide is higher, which
Interesting.
kind of keys into what you were just saying, like about social media, and it's about social comparison and value. So
Yeah.
if you're in this area where what you're seeing is all of the Teslas going by or the Mercedes, whatever the, fancy cars right now or the big houses, but you're not there, then what this Fed study would say is that you're at a higher risk for
Yeah.
suicide, as opposed
Which,
to, say, if you're living just with people in your own SES and you don't see that big difference.
yeah.
And I think that, going back again to social media, even for adults, I've thought for a long time it leads to unhappiness because this is my life, and what you're seeing, I really believe, is a fake version of other people's
Yeah.
lives.
Yeah.
Sometimes fake, sometimes not. But what you're seeing is my life. It doesn't look like that, and I mean that leads to all sorts of issues. How can I get out of this? I'm not successful. I'm not happy. When in reality, they might have a happy life. But
Right. So I have two thoughts that I want to bring up on this. The first
mhm.
is defining SES, which is
Yes, right.
socioeconomic status, and that is determined by your education, income, employment status, etc.
Right.
So it's just how you fare economically. And maybe that's part of the problem because as I think about this, it's how you fare compared to everybody else,
Yeah.
which again, it comes back to that comparison level, which is not helpful.
No,
And
it's
so,
not. But we do it. I mean, in our
yeah,
culture, we do it. And so
I guess I should say there can be value to that, right? Because that's how we identify people who need the help, right? Because and it is important to help people who are struggling economically, right?
and I agree with that. It's just that I wonder if that value doesn't exist like in Peru, that
Yeah,
focus.
that's true.
Here's the other thing I just wanted to say about employment. In that Fed study, it found that suicide risk for unemployed people is 72% higher than for someone who's working. So that's a real big risk factor.
And
And
that makes a lot of sense. And I wonder if they broke that down by gender because
not in, because I copied
okay,
it and it's not in front of me, so I didn't.
okay.
That would be a really good place to go. And
Yeah,
actually, at the end of the study, they're saying, okay, here are all the things we didn't look
right.
at that we
Yeah.
need to look at. That
Okay.
that would be one of them, certainly.
Yes,
Yeah.
well, because men are very much driven to provide. And if you have
Right.
a family and you're unemployed, I mean, that's a tough situation to be in. I mean, I remember watching my dad go through this, and you talk about a frustrated man,
Yeah.
who is stuck at home all day, not working.
Hmm.
It it was tough for him, I mean, because well, he had a family to take care of. So,
So again, from this Fed study, here's the other thing that stands out is that it's not necessarily being employed, but if you're, I think the term might be underemployed, where you aren't making a lot of money,
yeah.
and then that's a problem as well. And previous studies have found that $75,000 is the earnings tipping point in terms of happiness. I think that's higher now. I think that's an old figure.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it says if you raise your income from $34,000 to as high as $102,000, your suicide rates decreased only marginally.
Mm.
So again, to me, it's really contradictory in some ways and complicated because I think in our country now, there's such a disparity. So there's a lot of people who do really, really well, and there's a lot of people who struggle, and they might be employed, but they're underemployed, or they aren't, the wages are low. They can't afford health care. They can't afford a place to live, things like that. And so I think that's got to be a factor. when I was talking to my daughter, Sierra, who is a pediatrician, but we weren't talking about kids necessarily. She thought that one of the biggest factors that is a problem for us is that healthcare is so difficult to get for many people.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And that
Interesting.
in those
Yeah.
countries where they do have, let's say, that socialized medicine, that a lot of, I'm not saying it's a great system. I'm just saying that
Yeah.
people feel like they can they can go get health care, and it's not, you don't have to make a choice between, do I get my child taken care of at a doctor or do I eat dinner tonight? And
Yeah.
for some people in our country, that is a real choice
Yeah.
that they face. And so,
Mm-hmm.
but again, it's complicated. So, easing the burden for some of these families would be really important. And so as a culture, I don't know that we're doing a very good job of that.
Well, and so as you've talked about, mentioned, this different income levels and the
Hmm.
the rate it has on suicide, I think the determining factor is where are their values placed, right?
Well, I agree with that. I think that's really true.
You can live in poverty and shoot. I mean, Curtis and I lived in poverty, right? We were poor college students,
Yeah.
right? We were poor college students, but I mean, I would still describe those times as happy times in our
Hmm.
lives. We didn't have
Yeah.
an abundance of money, but our focus, well, I guess really what it is why we were still happy is because we had a plan, we had goals, we were working towards those goals, and our focus was on each other and our daughter. And so, I think this idea of hopelessness is, or these people who are in these low socioeconomic status and they feel stuck, like they have no way out, how can we help them come up with a plan to improve their situation in life? And what can we do to help them feel more connected?
Yeah, but you bring up a really good point that I don't know what the answer is to this, or if there is an
Yeah.
answer, and that is the values. Now, if
Yeah.
that book that I mention a lot, it's called Lost Connections by Johann
Mhm.
Hari.
Mhm.
I think he has 9 different things that he says we've lost connections to, and one of them is value. And so he's really linking it in some ways to a lack of a really good coherent value system. And if what you're really focusing on is, do I have the right car, or am I using the right telephone, or
Yeah.
whatever, do I have cable TV, any of those things that when you think about it are so unnecessary for
Right.
happiness.
Yeah.
But yet a lot of people get stuck in that mindset of, if I have these things, then I'll be happy.
Right.
Because the appearance is that these other people who have these things, somehow they're happy, or you get more status if you have these things. So I think it's an issue of values. I mean, it's not just that,
Right.
but
There's more to it.
I think it's one of those things that we don't talk about enough. And maybe the reason we don't talk about it enough is it's really, really hard to change that. What do you do?
Yeah.
How do you even change that in
Mhm.
a culture?
Yeah, I don't know. You're right. How do you change that value? I mean, we think of, we were just talking about this before we started recording. Media controls the world. And
Well, and I'm not, when I say what I'm going to say next, it's not that I'm anti-capitalist. I just think we live in a capitalist country, which means that you have people who are making things and they want to sell them. I mean, that's part of
yeah,
capitalism. And
yeah.
so the way the media and advertising gets involved is their job is to make you think you need this thing, whatever
Mm,
it is.
that's true.
And that's
Yeah.
what advertising does. And in reality, you don't need that thing to be happy, but
No.
yet but yet the media and advertising is convincing you that yes, you will be happier if you do that. Or even in
Yeah.
relationships, if you do this one thing, you'll be in this relationship with this wonderful person. So you need to buy this thing. So that is a problem, but it goes back to values, and how do you even change that? I don't have any answer for that.
I don't either. I mean, I think, maybe just more emphasis on family. How do we emphasize family more? And I want to acknowledge that some people genuinely have difficult and hard family situations, but you know what?
Right.
You can create a really good family. And so I
Yeah.
think, find ways to connect with people. So I mean, well, I think it just goes back to the title of this episode. The sobering truth about suicide is that family and values and human connection really matter. They're kind of the antidote.
They are.
Okay.
Okay, good takeaway.
Yeah. Next week, we are going to get into adolescent suicide with Dr. Adrian Burton Denmark. So this is Dr. Burton's daughter,
Yes.
who is also a psychologist, and she works a lot with youth.
You know, in this type of work, you kind of have a niche that you get into. Mine was couples. Hers has really been adolescents. Because her office is next to mine, and so I see a lot of adolescents in our waiting room waiting to see her.
Yeah. So we will get into that next week. In the meantime, I hope everyone has a good week.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.